What's up, guys? Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over an episode that a lot of you have asked me about. So there are a few different types of inventory systems and weapon systems in games, a lot of times action RPG games as well. So something that comes up quite frequently is, how are the weapons going to be generated? So first of all, are they going to be set items? Like an example I usually give is Dark Souls. So once you get this item, it has these values. Now you can upgrade it and things like that, but once it drops in the world, what you get is what you get. And there are specific tiers that you go up and increase it. It does a specific amount of damage. The other kind is what I think of like Borderlands. So Borderlands would be, there are different types of guns, and you can get the same weapon that has two different sets of stats. Now, depending on how you want your logic to be, this could actually change how you want to set up some of your inventory and how you want to set up some of your entries, so your weapons, equipment, and items. So I'm going to show you how to use class references today. This will do two things. One, it'll let you do all the functioning logic for static items. I'm calling them static. By static, I mean weapons that they're kind of set in stone. These are their stats. It doesn't mean they can't be upgraded, doesn't mean they can't be enhanced, but they're always going to have these values when they drop. Now, it's actually relatively easy to switch between the two. When we get our system up and running, I'll give you an example. But for now, I'm just going to show you how we can use our class references. You would notice before in the series, when we would pick up an item, the item would not disappear from the ground. So we would spawn a copy, but it would not be off of the ground or wherever we picked it up from. Now these things will go into our inventory. We will actually pick them up and they will disappear. This is because in the past, the reason it was left on the ground is because we had an object reference, and if we destroyed that actor, we would actually get rid of the reference, and thus we wouldn't be able to spawn an object in our hand when we clicked on it in the inventory, when we added it to our character's, gear that they're using. Using the class references, we're able to pick up something, destroy the actor, but then spawn an actor of the same class with the same data. So, it's actually going to be pretty simple today. We're mainly going to be just building on logic we already have and just changing over a few data types. So, I am going to show you everything that we had in here from before, and then show you what you can do as an alternative. So first things first, if you have not watched any episode of the series, I believe this is episode 25 of the Action RPG tutorials specifically, but we have about 40 third-person tutorials. So if you want to check out that playlist and all the episodes that got us to this point, I will link this iCard in the top right corner, and that is to the third-person tutorial series playlist. Otherwise, if you don't care about watching all that, there is the inventory episode, the first inventory episode here, which is going to be useful. All of our inventory is going to be useful for this episode, so if you want to get caught up there. Otherwise, I'm going to try and do a good job to just conceptually explain this, because it really is a conceptual thing. It's going to depend on your game for a lot of this. So let's take a look in our third-person tutorial character at our F inventory structure. Now, we've had this structure for many, many episodes now. I think since the very first inventory episode we had this. And what we had this thing called F inventory. It's a structure, and it had like a weight limit, or basically how many items we could hold, or how much weight we could hold, really. And then we had an item list, which was our array of items. Now, if you notice, these are object pointers. So what this means is this is a reference, basically. It points to an actor or an object of this type. So it has to have a default item that it can be set to. Otherwise, it's just null pointer, and it can't really be used for anything. And that was working fine. But as I said, if we destroyed the sword off the ground, as an example, then you wouldn't be able to pick it up and use it from your inventory later. So we didn't destroy it, but then it looked kind of weird because we picked up the sword, but there's still a sword on the ground. That doesn't look good, so we definitely need a solution to that. So what I've opted to do instead is grab the class of each item in my inventory. Now, every single item is going to be its own class. whether you realize it or not. Like, sure, they're all children of default item, but if I go and look at my things, if I go and look at my, like, weapons, I have a sword BP, okay? So this is the sword. It has a parent of base weapon BP, okay? So let's go to base weapon BP. All right, so that's a child of default weapon. So let's go to default weapon. Oh, that's a child of default item. So you can see everything relates back to default item, but every single piece of equipment, weapon, item, it's all unique. And because of that, we know that we're going to have something with a class of a default item. However, this is not a specific reference to an object. So instead of looking at it like, oh, I have sword 1, 2, and 3, this says, oh, I have sword BP. So if I had 3 swords, the item list would have a reference to each sword, and it would keep track of them like sword BP1, sword BP2, sword BP3. However, by using a class reference instead of an object reference, then you can see that instead of sword BP1, sword BP2, sword BP3, we would actually have sword BP, sword BP, sword BP. Now, with that in mind, there are times you would want an object reference as opposed to a class reference. So if I can have multiple of the same weapon that have different sets of data, what I mean by that, say I have 2 sword BPs. They're the exact same weapon, same name in the game. However, their stats are different. One does more damage, and maybe one gives you more attack speed. They are different swords. Even if they're the same item in the game, they have different stats. Because of this, I do need to keep track of the sword stats, each individual sword stats. So we can still use this object array. That's where we would use the object array because it would have the specific stats for that sword. So both of these can be useful, and we have to know when to use them. Now, typically, and at least in my experience, I don't think there's a lot of games that use both of these mechanics. It's usually, if you can enhance a weapon or upgrade a weapon, you can do it to pretty much all weapons. It's not, I don't think there's usually a mix of like, you can't enhance this one, but you can this one. Maybe for certain cases like, oh, this special legendary item you can't enhance. But understand that the object reference can do non-enhanceable weapons and enhanceable in keeping track of them, whereas the class reference list is only for static weapons. So a static weapon. Let's say we are playing Halo. So you can pick up any weapon off the ground. I know it's a shooter, not an RPG, but you can pick up any weapon off the ground, and it has a specific set of stats. You can never upgrade those weapons. There are other variations of the weapon, like there are the, I forget what they're called, but it's the other variation of like the battle rifle, and it does more damage, or it shoots a little bit faster. I think it's called like the Breaker BR. Now, that's a different weapon entirely. So same weapon concept, but they're actually different weapons in the game. And so that could use a class reference list as opposed to an item list, an object reference list. That might still be a little bit confusing, so don't worry, I have some examples ready as well, but it's very important we get this distinction down because your logic could very well depend on how you want your game to function. So let's lay it out one more time before we go any farther because we're going to start using this and separating the logic. So if you have object references like this top one that we already had in the series, that means that you have specific references to specific objects. Even if you have like the same exact item, the same piece of body armor, the same exact helmet, the same exact sword, they could have different stats. One might do more damage, one might give you more damage resistance. Okay? Now, if you have a class reference list, so you just have an array of just the class type, you can take the defaults that we set up on these items, so either in the data table or on the items themselves, they have data on them that we give them, and it can always use that information. We don't have to worry about specific items and their traits. If it's say it's a sword BP, then we know for a fact that the sword BP is always going to have 5 base damage, 0.75 base speed. You know, it's going to be common, all this stuff. All right. Those are the differences here. So this is important to note that you can use either or, and it will depend on what you want to do with your game. This is going to really set up some of the logic we need in the future for our inventory and how we're going to keep track of weapons. Because remember, when the player exits the game, we're eventually going to save, and we're going to have to know exactly what data we're going to have to save out. Otherwise, if we just do the class reference list and we care about the individual stats, we could save out the actor, and then the stats could be different the next time they log in, which would be kind of silly. I know I spent a lot of time on that, but it's a really important distinction to make. So if you want, for now, put them both in and check it out. So anyway, this is an array of the class default item. It doesn't keep track of the object. It just says it's an array of basically classes that are of this type. All right. Now, we can go into our CPP, and we can see there's only one spot we're using it for now because I'm trying to keep this generic since we're not going in a given direction. I'm just mainly explaining the different points to you. So here is how you would add each of these. Now, this is what we were doing before. We were just adding the item that comes into add to inventory, adding that to the item list. Now, to do this, this is how this looks. So add to inventory is actually from my character. I don't think I have that open. I do not. It's actually from my character. And it's basically when I press, I call it equip here, but it's basically when I press the button to pick up an item, we check the overlapping actors and we cast it to make sure it's a default item that we're overlapping with. And then we call add to inventory with that item that we're overlapping with. Now that's fine. We would never have to change that to like a class reference. We don't care about that. We just need the item that we're going to be adding to our inventory. Now here, yes, we just add it. However, if we want to go the class reference route, again, where everything is static and none of the stats change, nothing like that, then what we can do is inventory.theArray.add item get class. So instead of just doing item, you just do item get class, and it will pass the class type of the item into this array. Okay, so that's how you can add them, no matter the method you're using. They can get added to your array. Okay, now there is actually some other logic we need to do in here, and I'm giving you a few examples of what you could do for now before the entire system's set up. So if you actually look at this, this is our base character BP. Yet again, this is the character we're playing as. And we equip it, and we add it to our inventory. Well, what I actually do now is I do something that is not required for you guys to do. This is a third-person tutorial template as well. I'm trying to make this so that people could use it. And so for my needs, I need to be able to support both of those situations. And so what I've done is I've made in my third-person tutorial game mode, I've made this boolean here. And basically it just determines if the items they have random stats or, a range of stats. Okay, so I made that boolean, and then I'm actually just setting it in the game mode BP as opposed to in the code. So I can just toggle it on or off. And I'm going to show you some examples, so don't worry if it's still not entirely clear why we would use each one and when we want to. But here is what's important about this. So if you do go using the class reference route, so if our item stat static is true, that means, yes, we want to use class references. We don't want to use object references. If that's the case that you want to use the class references and the stats will always be the same, then we can flat out just destroy this actor that we're overlapping with. This is the cleanest method to do this because once this is the item we're going to pick up off the ground. Once this gets added to our inventory, we can flat out destroy the one on the ground. So right now, let's look, base game mode. So this is true. So it's going to go into this branch when we equip it. So you can see I do that. It gets destroyed. And then I spawn a new one when I do this, when I pick up the sword. And then I can attack with it. Okay? And that's working perfectly fine. In fact, it's working great. Because I know I just want to spawn a sword with the default values that the sword has, and that's it. I don't want to go any farther into it than that. Okay? Now, the alternative, if we say false right now, it gets a little bit trickier. So if we are using object references, we need to actually do a few things, and we're not quite at the point where we can do them yet. So for now, to get rid of an object reference, get rid of it off the ground, if we want to handle it that way, what we have to do is determine what type of item it is, cast to it, and then basically just make it invisible and disable all collision for the interaction box. It basically makes it completely invisible, and then you could transport it to your hand when the player clicks on it. Now this requires you to keep track of every piece of equipment or item that you have in your inventory and all the data about it. Now that's okay, but it is a little bit more work, which is why I'm trying to push the class reference method. Because with the class reference method, we can still save out data. We can actually still load data from that class reference. And we can do all this without any sort of object reference that's always around, right? It goes into your inventory and then you pull it out later. But just for now, if you'd like to keep using the object reference, or if you'd like to include both, just as an example so you can see how they both work and learn a little bit more about it, then here's something I've set up to make that work. So I take my default item, okay, and I grab the item type from it. Item type is just an enum we have in default item that determines if it's item, weapon, equipment, or some other one that we haven't used yet, but just in case there is another one. Then we're going to cast the corresponding type. If it's item, so we're doing a switch on this. And so if it's item, we cast a base item. If it's weapon, we cast a base weapon. If it's equipment, we cast a base equipment. Then we just set the corresponding data to be visible or not. So I'm going to set the static mesh for the item, weapon, and equipment to be invisible. New visibility off. I did put propagate to children in case the mesh had any children to also make them invisible. And then I grab the interaction box for all three, and I set collision enabled to be no collision. Now what this really does is it just makes the weapon invisible, and it makes it sit in place, and you can't interact with it or see it. And then what you'd really want to do is move that to your hand and attach it and make it visible and enable collision again when the character equips it. So you can see it's a little bit more work to do it this way, and really it's kind of a janky solution. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It will work. But it's a lot more stuff we have to do, and we're not really destroying it. We're kind of just keeping it there until we need to use it. That can be particularly weird when changing levels or level streaming. But for now, we can leave it like that, and that's how it can be. All right, now let's take a look at the other things we have here. So let's take a look at inventory window is the main other one that we need. We will also take a look at single inventory item, but we're not there quite yet. Okay, so let's look at inventory window. Now in inventory window, what we were doing is we were going through, we didn't have this cast to the game mode, so ignore that. We were grabbing the owner character of this widget, setting them to be a character reference, grabbing their inventory out of it, and then using the item list to loop through and set, basically populate the item list with all the items that we have and create this single inventory item widget for every single item. So it's basically this button with a name and a weight. All right, before we were just doing this method, as I've said, but I've added a different method down below. Now it's actually pretty much the exact same method. Like, you can copy and paste it. The only thing that changes are these two variables are not grabbed from the array element, but rather we use this get class defaults node. And I'll explain this here. So, what's really going on here is we're now looping through our class reference list instead of our object reference list. And that actually works fine. See, you have a default item class reference. Well, we need to call the set item details function on the object we just created, the single inventory item. Now, if we look at set item details, this is what it does, just so you're aware. It sets the type and the ID of the item in this widget so that it knows what data to pull from the data table. If you remember how our inventory is set up, we have data tables with information and details, and we pull that data and we set it equal to this object that we are going to create and spawn. So if we do that, or if we try and do that with the class reference, you'll never get anywhere. You can't grab variables off of the class reference alone. You can spawn an object and then grab the data from it, but you can't just I can't just do item type. It's not going to work like it will from an object reference. So instead, what you do is you drag off the array element and you get class defaults. Now, this will only work if your actual class defaults for these items are working properly. So the class defaults you can see for these are all the data in this item section here. All right. Those are the only ones that'll populate, as you can see here. Item type, item rarity, name, weight, and ID. If you look at this, item type, item rarity, name, weight, and ID. So those are the class defaults that it's referring to. And it's basically, we set these defaults on each object. Now, you can just pass these in to set item details like they were being passed in from the object reference. You just grab item type and ID. Since this class will be like sword BP, it will have the swords class defaults. So that's pretty simple. That little change, and then make sure you do the same logic as before where you drag from completed and go into the rest of the logic here. Would allow you to do the class references as opposed to object references. Again, more notes for my personal use, but if you really want to put both in your game, here's how you can do it. You just get a game mode reference here, as I've done. And then after you get your character reference, you make sure that the game mode reference is valid. The way you do this is drag in game mode, get it, right click, convert to validated get, and only if it's valid do you go into a branch using the r_item_stat static. And then if it's true, you go to the class reference one. If it's false, you go to the object reference one. Now, there's one other thing we should check out, and that's the single inventory item widget. We looked at it a bit with the set item details, but if you go to the event graph, you see immediately when we click on a button, or we either click on it or we use our menu system to select it, then we call retrieve item from ID. And what this actually does is grab data table information of the ID. Now, for this, what we actually did is we grabbed the data table info, broke it, and then set it to each of the fields for this object reference. Now, that's actually good. We do want an object reference, regardless if we're using the object references in our inventory or a class reference, because we need to be able to spawn it and use it and all this stuff. We want to be able to set variables on it and, stats on it. Maybe we want to enhance it in the future. Now, you can see here that we're actually using the data table info to set up the variables on the actor. And when you use a class to spawn to do so, we actually don't even use the object that was on the ground that we picked up ever. So our object reference list is kind of not working as intended. In fact, it's always been using this class to spawn data instead. And that's okay, because that's actually what I'm trying to push for here. We can use our class to spawn an actor and then still set data on it. So quite literally, we don't need the object references. Now, we do need to keep track of the data. So what I said earlier wasn't a lie. I didn't give false information. When we have a class reference alone, we can't just save out all the data about it. It's just keeping track of the class. But we still need object references. We still need to know the data about them. So we can actually save out data that we want to keep track of on specific items with IDs, as opposed to just looking at object references. And so with that, what I'm trying to prove here is that the object reference array that we were using isn't really necessary anymore. because you can see here we are just spawning a new one when we select it and setting the values. Now that's good. In fact, it's perfect because when we update a data table, then we can set the values on the actor that we spawned. So if I set it to true, I can go and pick up my item, it destroys it, and I can use my sword. Now, there's nothing stopping us from, once the item has been spawned, or if it's in our actual inventory, say we limit our inventory slots to like 50 slots or so, and we have an item box for the rest that the user wants to keep. There's nothing stopping us from keeping an object reference of the object that gets spawned to update the data on that specific weapon. So say we want to enhance it. We come over here, we kill our enemy, we level up, and we want to enhance our sword. Well, sure, it started as a class reference and it spawned an object. Well, what we should do is we should save out the data of the weapon and update the data table once runtime is finished. So once the user is done with the game or they log out, whatever the case may be. The reason I specifically mentioned that part of it is because you can't edit data tables at runtime. There's a reason for this, and it's because read-only access on a data table is insanely quick, way faster than an array, and very useful. But you can't edit at runtime, so you'll need to keep track of the data some other format, like a file format, and then update it when it's done. We're going to be spawning an object with the class reference anyway, and that object is the one that can hold the data. Then when we're ready, we can save out the data of the inventory items. Alright guys, and so with that, now we can use either object references or class references to get everything done in our game. We are going to go a specific route, and that is going to be covered in the next episode. I'm going to go over actually saving and loading this data. And once we go into saving and loading, once we get all that working, then you'll see why I pick what I pick. But it's important to know the difference of class references and object references and their actual purpose. So just remember, object references are when you need a specific object. I need that armor right there. Not that type of armor, that specific piece of armor right here. A class reference just means I need that type of object. So I could use that armor, or I could spawn a new armor, whatever, and they would have all the same data. So I'll go over my methods of how you can actually enhance equipment and save and load the changes in the next 2 episodes of this series. So hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, it's okay. It's going to make more sense in the next episode when you actually see it in action. But it is important to note the difference and also see both methods because, again, you do have a choice. It is up to you how you want to handle it. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else, and I really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership subscribers and my Patreon supporters. Thank you all for the love and support. Thank you for continuing to watch these videos and just keep me going because I really love working on these, and I'm glad you guys are excited as well. If you had any issues or you want to learn more about class references and object references, feel free to join the Discord community. Be happy to help you out. Anyway, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.